It's my great joy to introduce our second speaker tonight, Dr. Andrew Shead. Many of you will know that Andrew is the head of the Old Testament department here at Moore. He's a published author on a number of topics, most of them associated in one way or another with the prophet Jeremiah. A subscriber, or at least an avid reader of Scientific American. One of the few people I know who's constructed his own two-letter word dictionary for Scrabble. But a kind and generous pastor who seeks to understand the issues that are faced by Christians today and bring a biblical mind to them. So Andrew's going to come and speak to us on Does Christianity Have a Violent Past? Will you welcome Andrew Shead?
Thank you, Mark. Shows that you should never be introduced by someone who knows you too well. We've had the long talk with the short outline, and this is the short talk with the long outline. So don't fear. My brief is very different from Tony's. I'm not here really to talk about Islam at all. So shall we talk about Islam? No, not just now. Like Tony, my main conversation partners are secular Australians, but I want to help us think about the challenge of presenting the Christian God faithfully in a secular environment where all religions tend to be tarred with the same brush. Christians are increasingly accused, I think, of hypocrisy when we speak out against groups like ISIS or Boko Haram because our own religion is judged to be just as barbaric. Sometimes it's the Crusades that are singled out. Sometimes it's the intolerance and violence of the ancient Israelites when they wiped out the Canaanites. And the end point of this critique is usually theological. All this violence proves that our God is an immoral deity who needs to be dispensed with if we ever hope to build a fair, free, flourishing society. Now, your handout for this talk opens with a quote from the eminently quotable Richard Dawkins. I've written it down so I don't have to say it out loud. Now, the secular humanists that I personally know are not given to speaking as hatefully as Richard Dawkins, but I think their opinions are increasingly shaped by this sort of hate speech. Now, I have 20 minutes, so that allows me one main point, one secondary point, and one bullet point. My main aim is to look with you about what the Old Testament actually says about Israel's practices and religion. My second point is to look very briefly at the sort of God who stands behind those patterns of behavior. I'm sure I'll run out of time for my bullet point, but if you make me address it in question time, you will get this minty. So, what does the Bible actually say? Most attacks against the morality of the Old Testament begin very predictably with misrepresentation. So I've given you a verbatim extract, quite a long one, from Moses' instructions in Deuteronomy, and this one I will read out. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you've defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. This is what you are to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, and burn their idols in the fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. Now, I don't know if you find that, I expect you do, a somewhat uncomfortable text. You might even ask how it differs from a description of a group like ISIS. Phrases like destroy them totally, show them no mercy. And yet, if we look more closely, there are things that don't quite fit with that conclusion. For example, if Moses is commanding genocide, why tell Israel not to make a treaty? Why tell them not to intermarry? And notice too at the end of that passage when Moses gets down to detail, the specific violence he commands is against Canaanite religion rather than Canaanite people. So, moving on to my next heading, what did Israelites actually do? I want to begin with the book of Joshua, which is where the bad reputation of the Old Testament mainly comes from in this subject, and then step back to some other texts before returning to Joshua. Okay? Hope that's clear. So, as with Deuteronomy 7, a first reading of the book of Joshua is puzzling because it seems at points to contradict its own rhetoric of violence. For example, Joshua chapter 10 verse 40 and a number of other places, the narrator says that Joshua left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, which sounds frankly genocidal. 3 chapters later, however, we find the narrator matter-of-factly assuming that the Canaanite peoples are still present among us. And at the end of his life, we see Joshua give this warning to the people. I'm reading Joshua 23 verse 12. If you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you until you perish from this good land. So there are interesting tensions, aren't there, within the presentation of the book of Joshua. I don't know if you noticed in the last passage that I read out that the threat was not that the Lord would no longer destroy these peoples, but that he would no longer drive them out. And if you step back from the book of Joshua and have a look at the rest of the Old Testament to see how books other than Joshua describe the conquest, you will find language of driving out, language of expulsion is used much more often, the language of killing, to describe what happened. And what's more, if you read through the narratives of Judges and Samuel and Kings, they're very open about the fact that many Canaanites were neither killed nor expelled, but continued to live among the Israelites. Judges chapter 2, verse 23, for example. The Lord had allowed some of those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. What do we make of this? The reason I wanted to step back from Joshua for a moment was that I think it helps us to see, or at least to feel, that there is some sort of rhetoric going on that is peculiar to the account of the conquest. And this is a rhetoric that characterizes Joshua and to a lesser extent Deuteronomy, but not really the later books after that. All right. Now, if I'd been giving this talk 200 years ago, that would be about the end of it. But since then, we have dug up a huge body of texts and inscriptions from the time of ancient Israel, and we can now have the privilege of comparing Joshua with war accounts, conquest accounts written by Israel's neighbors. And very interestingly, when we look at those other accounts, we find exactly the same rhetoric being used. Here's one from the Moabite king Mesha to mark a temporary, very temporary, military victory over Israel. And he wrote, "Israel has utterly perished for always." I could multiply examples. We find the same sort of hyperbole used in inscriptions from Egypt, from Assyria, from the Hittites, simply to describe emphatic victories. And scholars are now have realized, in fact, that exaggeration or hyperbole was a literary device. It was part of the ancient conquest genre. Now, I know this is not a practice we feel comfortable with as in historical documents today, but conventions of history writing were different back then. And I wonder if maybe our modern equivalent is closer to the sporting commentator. You know, does this sound familiar? The All Blacks annihilated the opposition today. They literally blew them away. In that context, that sort of hyperbole, we know exactly what they're talking about. And 3,000 years ago, war was sport, basically. And exaggerated descriptions were neither intended nor understood literally. They were a way of expressing, if you like, the emotional rush of victory. Okay, that was a bit of apologetics there, but I think getting an accurate picture of what Israel actually did is crucial. And what I've been trying to show so far is that the so-called Holy War of the Old Testament was really more about distancing other nations than it was about destroying them. However, I don't for a moment want to suggest that there was no killing, let alone a religious and cultural intolerance that most modern people find highly offensive. Even if Joshua was not guilty of the massacres of a Boko Haram or an ISIS, isn't there a comparison point in the fact that Israel cleared a space in which to live by forcibly displacing those who agreed with their religion? You know, they may have done it more humanely than ISIS, but they did it nevertheless. So, how then did Israel justify what they actually did? And our task in this next point is really just to listen to the Bible's explanation of Israel's actions. All right, first of all, the Bible is consistently clear that the Canaanites were guilty of atrocities and crimes far beyond anything Israel did in expelling them. And when God used Israel as his instrument of judgment, he did it only after giving the Canaanites many, many years in which to stop their abuses. There's a really interesting line in Genesis 15 where God says to Abraham, in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So that's the first factor, Canaanite atrocities and war crimes. There's a real element of justice in the Bible's presentation of what happened. The second part of this scenario is the strong warning to Israel not to feel morally superior, but to be very conscious that the capacity and the tendency to commit atrocities was just as strong within them. I've printed some verses from Deuteronomy 9 on your handouts because I think it actually sets Israel on a higher moral level than our own society, which in my opinion displays an offensive degree of self-righteousness. Deuteronomy 9, after the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. And apparently that wasn't a good thing. I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, and I want to ask my next question there on your handout. Have we any evidence that this demonizing of the Canaanites is not just Israelite propaganda? I know it's a bit of a postmodern trendy question, but that's what we are. Now, the answer to this question, I think, is abundantly clear, once again, in numerous texts and images that we've unearthed from Israel's contemporaries. They describe torture and bloodbaths and reprisals and massacres in graphic and gleeful detail. And the ultimate justification for all this butchery came from their religion. Now, I've given you an extended description of what it took to sate or satisfy the Canaanite goddess Anath. I'm going to leave it you to read it later, but in summary, this is a deity who decorates herself with the severed heads and hands of townspeople and old men while she wades knee-deep in their blood. But she's still not satisfied until she can lure their soldiers and heroes to hospitably arranged tables and then slaughter them unaware. These were the gods the Canaanites venerated. And I want to finish in a moment by looking at the character of the Old Testament God. But let's begin with the behavior of his people. I probably needed another little heading here, because I want to comment just on a couple of ways in which Israel's behavior stood in strong contrast to the behavior of their neighbors. And the reason I want to do that is because this contrast is the ultimate proof of their different value systems, their different theology. So, by contrast with the Canaanites, Joshua and his army did not kill indiscriminately. They selectively targeted political leaders and enemy soldiers. Women, children, non-combatants were off limits. Archaeology suggests that even cities like Jericho and Ai, which were completely destroyed, seem to have been actually military strongholds with virtually empty of civilians. Canaanites who respected Israel's gods, such as, for example, Rahab and her family, were free to live among the Israelites. One final contrast, the holy war, so-called, instituted under Joshua, was strictly a one-off event. Once they were settled in the land, Israel was forbidden from conducting further wars of conquest. After Joshua, the only war permitted was defensive war. Israel had no standing army. Their fighters were paid no money. Participation was strictly voluntary. And kings didn't even have authority to declare war. They had to wait for a prophet to give them God's permission. Now, I don't know if that description I've given you sounds reasonably normal or not, but in the ancient world it was utterly unique. Utterly unique. And just as Canaanite social values were intimately connected to their idea of the gods, so Israel's unique behavior came from its unique God. So my final and quite brief point is to consider what sort of God Israel actually served. And I want to do that by talking about Exodus. Not for too long, sadly, because it's a great book. The God of the Old Testament could not be more different from the fictional character invented by Richard Dawkins. He is the same God on every page, and the foundational document for Israel's doctrine of God is the book of Exodus. You know the story. Exodus is the story of a group of slaves rescued by a God they do not know, who takes them on a journey to a mountain where they will meet him face to face and be changed for good. And everything that happens to Israel serves to show them more of what this God is like, what his name means. Exodus is like a 40-chapter long progressive revelation of the meaning of the name, the Lord. By the time they've crossed the Red Sea, what have they learned? His name means Saviour and Warrior. Read chapter 15. By the time they get to the mountain of God, what new thing do they learn? They learn that this God, unlike every other God, is not part of the creation. He's the creator of everything. He's outside and above the universe, and he is jealous for his name. Because when people name the creation as God, they cut themselves off from the source of their life and they die. That's the logic of the second commandment. It's not on your handout, but listen to it. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So far, so good. Israel's journey is going well. They've reached the mountain. They're discovering what God's name means. But as we arrive at the terrible tragedy of the golden calf, we must face with Moses a new and unexpected question about God. Can there be room in his nature for mercy? So the climax of the book comes in chapter 34, when God speaks his name once more. And in the wake of Israel's sin and judgment, we are taken, as it were, all the way in to God's nature. And this is on your handout. Moses said, "Now show me your glory." Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Now, I wish I'd written the second commandment on your handout, because in those words that we've just looked at, God reverses his self-description for the second commandment. Here, he mentions his mercy first, and he no longer offers it only to those who remain obedient. With God there is no mercy without judgment, and there is no judgment without mercy, and yet mercy comes first and mercy comes last. I'm going to skip the other verses in your handout because it's time to wrap up. So where are we? My point in talking about the character of God, it's not just that it's great to do, but it's only when we understand Israel's unique God that we can understand what was really going on in Joshua's war of conquest. Joshua was being commanded to clear a space in the world of idols so that God's true nature could be apparent to the whole world. And this is crucial. The whole point of the exercise is not to bring good to Israel, but to the whole world, to every nation, just as God promised Abraham back in Genesis 12. And nothing shows the universal purpose of the conquest more remarkably than the subsequent story of Israel. What happened, do you remember, when Israel turned away from God to worship idols? God mercifully warned them, did he not? Gave them many years to mend their ways, just as he did for the Amorites back in Genesis. But in the end, he expelled Israel from the land exactly as he had expelled the Canaanites before them. And he actually used another nation, Babylon, as his instrument, exactly as he had once used Israel. God is no respecter of persons, and his wrath against human evil is not in spite of his love, but because of it. Well, I believe we're out of time, but for those interested in digging deeper, I can recommend a book by Paul Copan called Is God a Moral Monster? Tony will put it up on the website afterwards. But let me give you a short quote from his book by way of conclusion. For a specific, relatively short and strategic period, God sought to establish Israel in the land with a view to fulfilling this long-term, indeed cosmic, plan of redemption. God would simultaneously punish a wicked people ripe for judgment. Not doing so would have erased humankind's only hope for redemption. Well, thank you.